Yeah. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Developing countries are in a very awkward place in the world right now because they need to balance the short term and the long term. They need to balance the short term of economic gains versus long term things such as being able to go into the knowledge sector through things like education. Overall, we believe that developing countries need to be able to sustain their short term and then expand into the long term so that they're able to best survive in the future. And we see that currently they simply do not have the ability to administrate things like education because they are busy doing other things like focusing on the economy. Therefore, we believe that it's vital that we outsource this burden off of the government's backs, and so that we're able to better develop these countries as a whole. And we on site gov believe that this outsource would also actually lead to a better education system in the country overall in the short term and in the long term. So first of all, what are the priorities of developing countries and what do these developing countries look like? We see that the administration often can't focus on education, and even if they do, it's not going to be very good either because there's not enough expertise within these countries to be completely understanding of like what kind of administration you need to run a school or like what type of model is best for the education of students. And overall, we believe that on our side, we need to solve for these types of problems. Second of all, what is the basic reason as to why there are low educational outcomes in the status quo? The reason why there are low educational outcomes is because of the poor economy that the country is in. People often need to work in their families or have external burdens before they're able to go to school. And additionally, the overall low quality of living makes it very hard for people to go to school overall. So what do we propose then? We say that instead of the government building schools themselves, we grant incentives for private educational institutes. This looks like giving them cheap land to be able to build schools on. This looks like lowering taxes on schools. And this also looks like an increasing subsidy for schools so that they can make their tuition cheaper and make their school accessible for the average person. What the overall effect of this is that for the government, this is extremely good because they don't have to take on the burden of needing to spend manpower and needing to spend people to try to administrate schools across the country. And this means that they're able to focus on more pressing problems. Additionally, we say that this also means that we are best able to provide governments are best able to save their money as well because they don't need to spend the long-term costs of administrating the school, and they only need help these schools like set up. Secondly, we see that so before I move on to my arguments, I'll pick up your.
What makes people under your side of the house want to attend these schools when they are needed in their farms or family works?
Okay, we believe that people want to attend these schools because there's a general belief that education is something that is very important, and we say that overall this means that people still try to go to school to some extent. However, we just need to make sure that if they're taking if they're spending the time to go to these schools are actually good and they actually have the teachers that are needed in order for these people to get a good education. So why is it that we get better education on our side? It's because first of all, these schools have like these private educational institutions have things like connections and resources and the administrative capacity to be able to run their school. They have connections because they know for example, teachers overseas that are willing to come to this country. It looks like they already have like a group of investors and people willing to help them set up this school and have created a type of trust within the sector that they are working in. Therefore, it's far more likely that they're able to get good teachers and good resources for their school overall, making this entire educational process more worth it for the people that want to take part in it. But also because they actually have the manpower and they actually have the people that they can hire in order to be able to create an administration that can better handle the schooling process. However, governments often aren't able to do this because they need to spend and spread their resources very thinly. And we say that overall, in the long term, is far more beneficial for the government to not need to take on all of these burdens, and it's far easier if you let these private sectors take on the burdens for you. Secondly, we see that the reason why educational institutions will improve in the long run is because there can be a gradual transition to public sectors on our side. What this necessarily means is that when teachers come into your country and when teachers are starting to be trained by these private sectors, what you get is a revolving door effect in which when your country is eventually like far more developed and when your country is far more capable of, for example, managing its economy, it becomes so that you're able to get these teachers that were trained in these places to be able to transition to the public sector. However, you don't get this transition of expertise into your country at all on their side. On our side, when you have these connections, when you have these resources, it's far easier for these teachers to get in your country in the first place, and so that you can make that transition into the public sector in the long run. What this looks like is, for example, in lots of Asian countries where public schooling systems are extremely based off of, for example, their past colonizers, like private schools that they built in these places. What this means is that there can be this share of knowledge between public and private, and this ultimately makes it so that it's far more likely on our side that once your country is stable, you're actually able to get a good system, whereas on their side, they're simply starting from scratch. Lastly, we say that the government can likely copy the systems that these schools operate under. What this means is that you create a blueprint for what a successful school probably looks like, and they're better able to mimic these types of things. However, on their side, it's increasingly unlikely because these schools don't even come to your country in the first place, and it's very difficult for you to have the sufficient amount of connections and knowledge in order for you to build up this education system. So in the interest of the long term and in the interest of especially these developing countries, so proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for the kind speech, and I'd like to invite the Leader of Opposition.
A better education system is nothing if people do not want to attend school. I'm going to start off with 3 points of framing before moving on to my arguments. First, in terms of what privatized schools will look like. Two, why people, who are the people who go to these public schools, and why is it that they have these low educational outcomes? And three, what these developing nations look like. So first, in terms of these privatized schools, the government side had to concede that regardless, tuition is going to definitely be higher because they will have to be able to hire like more resources to be able to convince the government in terms of showing that they have this ability to improve the educational system. What this means is that they will have quite a large like startup cost or have a lot of things that they have to work on. Regardless, even if they get a subsidy or something like that, it's still going to be comparatively a lot higher than any like public school that people would be able to attend freely. Secondly, who are the people that attend public schools, and why is it that they don't necessarily help? They drop out of these systems, right? We think that people who attend public schools are likely the people that are of lower income or of like are the majority of the developing nation, because those like rich parents or rich kids will likely already go to these privatized educations who can already get the education system that they need. But secondly, then the people that go to these public schools are also likely like the reason that there's a high dropout rate, or the reason that there's a high there isn't a high attendance, is because there are structural reasons that make it so that they aren't able to dedicate their whole attention onto like education, right? What this means is oftentimes they have to spend time like working in their family or helping out their family on their like business. So these are things that make it so that that it makes it very difficult for them to attend these schools. Later, what this means and what developing nations affect, we think that the problem is they don't necessarily take education as seriously as it should be. So as it should be, because they have this opportunity, as said by the government side, we think that is what needs to be changed, so that comparatively we have like people within these developing nations actually caring more about education. How we are going to do this then, in our counterfactual, we are actually going to make incentives for people to go into school. So what this means is that for individuals with like a high attendance rate for each school, or individuals with like receiving like better grades, let's say the top 5%, are able to get certain subsidies towards their families, so that we actually incentivize individuals to actually attend these public schools and attend classes. We think that is likely going to offset the potential financial gains that these families would have been able to get if this person was actually like working in their own homes. So the problem is these structural reasons that make it so that the families actually would prefer their children to stay at home to be able to help, like let's say on the farm, to help their families grow in that sense. I'll take care of you.
How can you ensure that the financial gain that you provide to these families are going to outweigh, for instance, them working in a farm?
We think that having these incentives in itself is, even if it doesn't necessarily like completely outweigh what they could potentially earn having the child in like working at home, we think that at the very least it creates this perception or idea on why it's important to have education within the system, or have education as a really important factor for children to be able to like help their families climb out of like their current status, or be able to move up the social ladder, right? Because having this incentive ultimately sends a signal towards families, showing them that education is actually something very important, and something that they are able to that is something very important, something that is necessary for people to be able to like gain that knowledge, and to be able to like become more specialized verticals, right? Because ultimately that is the aim of education, right? It is for the government to be able to have a society where people are better informed, have a better knowledge, and also have the skills necessary to help develop their nations from within. Secondly, then later, in terms of why we are actually more likely to have like an education system that is better for the people. What this means is, when we have like the government being a part of the deciding process, we think that the government also has that right to be able to decide in terms of what the things are necessary for their own nation, because ultimately they're very like, it's quite unique in a sense for each country in terms of what necessary like skills or things necessary for their own society, right? We think that what this means is that when we have close attention, we have people that are actually paying attention into the education system, and people that are like wanting to go to school. This means there's actually more like scrutiny, or more scrutiny, and more people actually wanting to attend school, or more people that are actually wanting to go to school. That allows for like people to actually help improve the public education system for these individuals that are of the lower income, and then allow them to be able to have that decent degree of like education. Because ultimately, we do not think that the public schools, the curriculum itself, is necessarily the problem for these low educational outcomes. It is ultimately the structural problems surrounding the ideology of how important education is towards these individuals that make it so that people do not attend like school. I'll take your POI.
There isn't just one kind of private school. There are expensive private schools, and there can be cheaper private schools. Privatized schools can adapt to the local environment until people start going, or else there's no point in having a school in the first place.
We think regardless, privatized schools, when we have like these privatized schools within the nation, or setting up within the nations, it makes it like quite difficult in a sense for governments to be able to be a part of that deciding process in terms of like what the curriculum looks like. Regardless, even if there's like cheaper private schools or like more expensive private schools, we think what this means for people is that ultimately, like even if it's still going to be quite a difficulty for students to be able to like go towards these schools, and having that and having to depend on like external sources for developing your own nation's like importance of education doesn't necessarily mean that we're able to help like education become a more important thing. We think what the most important thing we do on our side then is that we put a higher importance on what education is rather than giving it and then allowing it to be privately outsourced, because regardless a better education system may not necessarily translate to more importance on the education system. Very proud to do this.
I take the lead of opposition for that final speech, and I take some invite Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think side opposition in this debate has dodged the real question of how they're going to actually solve and salvage the education system from their categorization in their first speech, because they never tell us how they're going to solve the issues that they talk about, and insofar as we prove why we achieve the impact of long-term high-quality education and like long-term economic impact, I think we deserve to win. So firstly, 3 things in my speech. Firstly, on major responses against this side of the case, and secondly, on the extension on how we increase better educational outcomes for students on the ground. So first of all, they tell us that, okay, sure, on their side, tuitions in these schools will be much higher than that of a public school. I think we concede this, right? Obviously, if we're going to provide high quality education, we do agree that these tuitions are going to be significantly higher than that of a public school. However, we think that the long-term benefits of this system cannot be co-opted by any other institution out there, and they don't actually challenge our first argument on how Western education and like how foreign institutions are able to benefit students on the ground, right? So second of all, I think that these schools that we're talking about, these foreign institutions, are going to hijack the tuitions, make them so super duper expensive and making them unaffordable for the average individual. Because if they're so expensive, then nobody is going to go to the school to begin with. So there's going to be a reasonable price range as to how the school is going to be like, as to how the school is going to cost, right? But secondly, they also tell us that low turnout rates are due to structural reasons in the status quo, and therefore they are going to offer financial incentives for households to incentivize students to go to school. However, I just don't think the state has the capacity to fund every single student right now, because even so, I think it's perpetuates wealth inequality within public schools themselves, because some students are more able to succeed in that institution than others. So therefore, other students are given the same opportunity to succeed in that academic institution. But secondly, I think that even if you do provide these incentives, families on the ground will still prioritize their kids farming, because they want to prioritize short-term agricultural gains and to boost their income in the short term, rather than prioritizing long-term educational interest for their children, because I think because the average family on the ground just doesn't understand how important education actually is. Right? Oh no, thank you. So the alternative on their side of the house is that the rich people in the status quo go to international schools that are even more isolated from society, but on our side of the house, we give them a middle ground alternative in which they can go to these foreign institution schools that are more connected to the culture of the country and. So next on why in the status quo the education fails people on the ground. So first of all, in the status quo, there's incredibly low funding. The state is unable to afford for educational infrastructure, or rather that the majority of the government funding is going into other sectors that short-term directly boost the economy. So the government right now is prioritizing short-term economic gains over that of long-term education of individuals. So what is the model on our side of the house? I want to clarify that we can offer government subsidies for these private schools to lower the tuition rates, right? Because these schools have the administrative capacity to make schooling more accessible. They can change their policy to make it more accessible in the long run, right? So onto the extension on why we ultimately improve the quality of education in the long run, and this is the only impact that is brought up in this entire debate. So therefore, we win on this impact. So firstly, foreign institutions that come to these poor countries are able to educate local teachers who learn certain teaching methods, especially at Western teaching styles, etc., and to bring in English textbooks, etc., or like other novel practices. So with these institutions comes a large proliferation of knowledge that you aren't able to get on their side of the house because the education system is static. There's no teachers coming in and educating the current population. So there's less and less teachers in the status quo, and there's less and less education. People don't want to go to school because their teachers are lazy. So obviously students won't academically excel in their subjects. So on our side of the house, we're improving the quality of education in the status quo because people will go to accrue these skills to develop the education system as a whole, right? If we have more teachers because we have more classes like Kumon coming in to this country, like there are going to be more people becoming teachers, and some of these teachers can also go teach public schools like in other communities, which widens the overall access of education of our side of the house. But secondly is about students, and it's the most important impact in today. What happens to students on our side of the house? Well, because students are accessing high quality education, and even if they are a minority, we're accessing elite education that has been unprecedented in this country, so they're more able to create like startups, establish companies, or become intellectuals in the healthcare sector, the engineering sector, for instance, or the justice system. Although this may seem very, very long term, it is because these students are able to access more knowledge to begin with. Yeah, go ahead.
But I wish to say in terms of students, actually, like people within the country just want short-term solutions, like they will want their children to going into farming and things like that. What's making them to want to go to these public privatized schools?
Well, we're telling you that because both sides want better education and like better outcomes in the future, we are prioritizing a long-term model in which even if a small minority of people on our side of the house are only able to access this type of education, over time we have more foreign private schools coming into the country. You're gonna have more English teachers in the community, etc., which like intermingles with the current public education system. Because overall, like this intermingling of different types of education is overall beneficial for the quality of education in general, and therefore we're able to improve and get high quality education. So again, on the idea of students, know that this is the prerequisite to you boosting the number of educated people in the country working to increase economic development, right? Because the priority of this country is to boost its economic development. So even if only a small number of people are able to access this type of education to begin with, we think this is still better than having no turnout rates in public schools on this to the house. Sure, there will be high turnout rates for our schools on our side because people who are middle income are confined to the public system, and they're able to access higher quality education. So lastly, on our impacts, firstly, when foreign countries see more individuals coming in these countries becoming increasingly educated, they're going to want to invest in these countries that have higher skilled laborers, etc. They are going to want to establish more sectors and like more startups in these countries. So overall, we're able to improve or to get better economic development on our side of the house and better quality education. Thank you.
So the next 5 minutes into the parent speech, I'd like to next invite the deputy CEO.
All right, everyone ready? Private education institutions don't operate on a basis or on a metric of merits, right? They operate on an incentive that are purely economical in which they can ensure that they actually get profit. I don't think Proposition Side fully acknowledge this and realize, and they just try to paint this picture that these private education companies are simply going to these countries out of pure altruistic reasons. But firstly then, I want to go on to some clarifications. Obviously, under our side of the house, the government would be able to calculate the amount of incentive that they are able to give or amount of funding that are able to give the students that are always going to be bigger than the opportunity cost they lose from, for example, working in their family farm, right? Note that this is probably not going to be a huge cost simply because like a 10-year-old's labor output is probably going to be a lot less than a real grown man working in a factory, right? But secondly then, I just want to repaint the incentives of private education institutions and how exactly does this manifest. 4 things I want to talk about this. 1, what do these private education institutions actually look like? We think they are probably from developed countries and usually has a board and a group of investors behind it, right? Simply because that they're probably already a private institution under their side of the house. The implication of this is that they always have an obligation to maximize profit because that they have to tell their investors, their board, that this big investment that they make in a developing country would ensure high return, and that is a smart investment that they already made. But thirdly then, how does this exactly manifest? The government either has to pay really high subsidies or allow these private institutions to charge higher in order for them to actually maximize profit. Note that this is likely, what is likely going to happen is that the government might give a lot of subsidy at first because they have the amount of resources capable of doing that in the short term. But within that, in the long run, these resources are probably going to be used and run out eventually. This means that they ultimately have to concede to a world in which, on the long run, these companies are charging extremely high tuition fee and basically have no checks and balances between the government and the private education institution. But fourthly, then, why is this bad? 3 reasons as to why this is bad. 1, in the short term, there's going to be huge opportunity costs that they lose, right? Because even though that they are attracting like private institutions to come into, we think that insofar as they're unable to get students to go into these education programs, probably this is going to be a waste of money that could have been, for example, raised in helping turnout rates in the public education system or other sorts, right? But secondly, then we think that on the long term, it's just going to become a really elitist and rich, exclusive education program in which only people with the capability of paying a high tuition fee are able to go to. But thirdly, then, we think that they're also going to lose the inherent check and balance system that they so want to push for, right? Because there's always going to be the discrepancy of funding between the government and the private education institutions. This means that the government under their side of the house are always going to be on the disadvantage. This means that they cannot monitor the school, they cannot, for example, look at their teaching method or restrict their quality of education, right? This looks like, for example, when these education institutions want to cut costs in order to maximize profit, these local government isn't probably going to do much about it and probably can't do much about it. The comparative under our side, as Vera has already told you, is that students would be willing to go to school when they're provided the funding to do so and get a diploma and eventually get a better job and a better social mobility. But secondly, then I just want to talk about some responses from proposition side of the house. Firstly, they want to talk about that there's going to be a transition into the public sector and that teachers are going to stay in the country and go into the public sector and eventually raise the education quality, right? We tell you that this is extremely unlikely to happen because the very reason why these people come into these developing countries is because they're incentivized by money. This means that once the money is gone, they likely won't stay, right? But secondly, then I want to note that most public schools are never going to outweigh the pay that private schools offer. So this means that even if these really high quality teachers choosing to stay, they're probably going to choose to stay in private school either ways. We don't think people from on the ground up would even benefit from this. But secondly, I also want to flip this argument that actually on our side of the house we're better able to raise the educational quality on the ground up. Because their side of the house, they rely on teachers who are incentivized by money, but under our side of the house, we actually rely on domestic teachers who actually live here. This means that in the long run, when the country has the economic ability to administrate the education sector, it means that these teachers would also be more loyal to the country, be more committed to the reforms that these countries want to make. But secondly, then, why would people under their side of the house still won't go to school? 2 reasons. We think A, because that the education system has already been really bad for a long time in this developing country, people already have an intrinsic bad public perception of what education does to you. They probably think that education is just a government agenda to fulfill some requirement, right? So it's extremely hard to change this public perception. Move on to the second reason. Yeah, go ahead.
The issue is not that nobody wants to go into education. It is because they think that they're getting nothing out of the current system. So how do you improve a system if you're just using the same teachers?
No, I think the issue is that the matter of family and your own survival is ultimately always going to outweigh potential gains you get from the education system. So even if the education system's quality is extremely good, people are probably not going to go attend, because not going to attend also means that you lose a lot of money you could have gained from working in your family farm or providing for your family, right? But thirdly then, I just want to note that their claim about like providing Western education system into this developing country isn't actually practical at all. Because how is this in any way tailored to developing country with a diverse culture that probably isn't going to conform to the traditional Western system of education? We think that like actually able to teach these curriculum on the basis of how their culture is based upon, it's probably going to be a better comparative, right? This means that on their side of the house, they also cannot access the sort of impact they're trying to say about like, oh, learning from the blueprints or learning from the model these private education system built for them. Because all in all, we think that people who live in these countries, the public institutions who are funded by the government are going to know the quality and how to actually build up a good education system for their country. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition, for that fine speech. I'd like to next call the government whip.
The issue with opposition side is they have absolutely no impact. The strategy they try to go for is to use subsidies to incentivize high turnout rates. We tell you that this strategy is largely flawed because A, you're unable to provide more and more money than the wages the kids earn if they do not go to school. B, you don't solve the core issue of poor education. Both sides on the short term, we do agree they might not be able to have solve low turnout rates. But however, we already loses when Jim tells you you cannot improve education under this side of house in the first place. And we're going to explain to you why in the long run we're going to get better education and higher turnout rates and a better economy later on. Also, just a tangent, we want to clarify. Jim tells us that all of these companies will be foreign companies. We tell you that it might be also domestic private companies. So even if they do somehow do not get profit, they're still gonna operate within the country. There's no opt-out system. They cannot just fly internationally. Three problems then. Firstly, what do these schools look like, right? We can concede that these schools might have slightly higher tuition, but the trade-off is that we get kids who are willing to go to school and do not have to worry about money. Sure, maybe these kids are higher than the average person. These kids have more money than average person, but we tell you that because this tuition is high, it means that parents will pressure school to provide things like better resources, right? If they do not have a good facility and bad teachers, no one will want to go to a private school, and because they are profit driven, that's why these schools will likely create a better facility and allow for these parents to be satisfied that they're sending their kids to a good institution. Secondly, we also tell you that there's a selective process, right? Because these private schools are quite limited and they have high tuition that likely and good resources. That means there's a high demand for these schools. So therefore, the students will have some sort of ambition, and because if they get expelled, they're already going to be another student who's waiting to get in, and we don't think that people within the school is gonna try to slack off because of how good the school is in the first place, right? Secondly, we want to talk about some burden on the opposition side. They need to prove two things to be able to win this debate. Firstly, they need to prove to us why there's an incentive for kids to go to school, even if the subsidy is less than the work. Secondly, why there's a capacity for the schools to offer good education, allow students to thrive without the private institutions. Thirdly, then, what is this debate about? We tell you that this debate is about, firstly, who gets better education, and secondly, who creates better economy and solves the issue of the low turnout rates in the long term. So go on to the first question. Why do we get better education for kids, right? We think that Henry already pointed out a few things that already shows why we get better education in the first place. But firstly, you get better teachers. There's experienced teachers. It also means that there's more motivation for these kids to learn and do well within school, because good teachers likely means that the kids like working with the teacher, and kids will focus and learn more when they're in a good environment. Secondly, you have better resources. For instance, better classrooms and better technology that allows students to be able to learn better. And thirdly, you have incentivized kids who because they do not have to worry about like certain economic things. Like that's why that's why like they're more willing to focus on things like school. So what happens under their side of the house, right? Firstly, you tell you that no one probably shows up because your subsidy is always going to be lower than your wages. Maybe you work by maybe like some people will go into the school for maybe like a few bucks, but then even if they do show up, they do not prove why these people will listen in class or just even see the benefit in working or doing certain classwork. So we don't understand why these people will be accepting and allowing the education system to flourish. Thirdly, even if they do listen, we tell you that education quality is quite low and the things they learn isn't going to be useful. And fourthly, it's already difficult and there's a high barrier to learning well under their side of house simply because of the bad facilities and the bad resources provided within these public schools. We think that due to all of these reasons, it's unlikely that the kids coming out of their school are going to learn much and do well under their side of house. What is the comparison? What is the impact of this? And we tell you that when you do get better education for kids, that likely means that these kids will maybe flourish in the future and get better jobs and be able to start certain companies or even learn how to become a teacher themselves and enter into the public. So like Henry told you, there's going to be a revolving door effect where you get like better teachers, you get like more people who are well educated to start like educating the rest of the public, right? But then that leads me to a second and more important clash about why we get better economy, and that means that we better the education system and solve the low turnout rates, right? We tell that education is important. Why? Because it increases economy. It allows for your long run aggregate supply curve to shift, right? Which means you get more productivity, you get like more people to you get more less unemployment, and you get like people to do better. You get education means better businesses, right? Why is this the case? Because when you have education, you learn things like organizational skills. You get soft skills learned in school when you do projects with your friends or whatever, and you also are able to have more knowledge about like global geopolitical like things. So Janet already tells you we reduce brain drain as well, which means that the rich and educated do not flow into foreign countries, and likely means that those who are educated are going to start their companies domestically because these are the areas they grow up with in and stay and start their domestic companies, right? But then what this means is that there will likely be more foreign FDI into the country because foreign investors see firstly you trying to improve your education in the first place, so they'll trust the government and the country more, and they'll feel safer in investing in your economy in the first place. Your higher education means that you have more investors in the first place, and when you invest in these, and you'll probably also invest in these private schools itself because you feel like growing up you have gone to the school and it has helped you a lot. Secondly, people who start companies who are students in the school likely also will invest in the school because they're grateful for education. But secondly, you have a good knowledge of the world and have skills like diplomacy. You have skills like negotiations that are crucial within the business world. That likely means that foreign FDI will increase because the businesses coming out of these, the businesses that are created from students that come out of these institutions will likely be able to get more business partners and more international connections because they learn how to convince people and they understand like things like what is the economy like in the US or what is the economy like in China, right? So therefore they'll be able to have much better connections and much better like business partners as well, and their businesses will be much more successful compared to their side. So the impact of this is that you solve the root cause for low turnout rates when your parents have more money to send kids to school with wages. Because when you have more companies that are successful, when you boost the economy within the country itself, that likely means that there are more wages because productivity increases and education is better, and it's basic economics when we tell you that when you get better education, you get more workers who are paid better. And we tell you that there's a trickle down effect that they do not get under their side of house because when you do not have good education, when people who are actually educated are starting companies outside of the country, and instead of domestically, you do not improve your economy. You have massive brain drain under their side of house, and that is why we very proudly propose.
Thank you, Governor, for that part speech. The next is by the opposition. Okay. So my speech will start in 3, 2. Until this point of the debate, I still don't understand why Proposition Side thinks private companies are charities that help improve the environment, the teacher, and everything about the education with little government help at the initial phase of developing the school. Okay. We're very unclear as to how individuals are going to be persuaded as an average individual who work in agriculture that the 10 people that succeed and become an entrepreneur are going to be my son when he doesn't have any education and he doesn't have any quality that are similar to those individuals who are already far richer than me and have parents that are far richer than me, than my son. That's to say that on Proposition Side, they still don't prove how the increased amount of quantity of individuals who are actually the majority of low or middle income individuals who work in agriculture are likely going to enter this educational system they frame on their side of the house. Before going into the clash on how we improve the educational performance and student attendance on our side of the house, we're going to clarify what our counterfactual actually looks like. As Mary already told you, we have a tax cut or a subsidy, for example, for a high amount of attendance, for example, 80% of attendance for individuals who go to school, or like, for example, they have additional tax cut for high performance in school. The reason why it is effective is because that firstly, we were already told in gym speech that, for example, the 20 corns your kid pick up is far less efficient than, for example, the money you got from tax cut to buy a machinery to get more crops in, right? We think that it is very logical to say that a 10-year-old child is less efficient than, for example, a machinery that you can buy using this tax cut. And this is why we think that our model is effective in a way to incentivize parents to provide education for their child. But second, we think that money means that parents pay attention to how students do because they still pay some amount of tuition for their students to go to school. And this means that they care more about, for example, the education, for example, the content of the teaching, or like, for example, the quality of the teaching. This means that with more and more parents making attention onto the educational system, the government are more likely going to be pushed to provide better form of education in, for example, teacher training. The reason why this is very important for paying attention and leading to long-term improvement of education system is because that firstly, the government spends active amount of money per year or per month onto those individuals who go to school. This means that they are obligated to, for example, pay more attention into what actually happens in school, what actually happens to students after they graduate from school. And second, we think that parents see, for example, the child having good performance or they don't have enough performance. They are actively wanting to know what happens in school. This means that more and more people with government push to know more about what happens in school, and parents wanting to know because the financial cost they give for students going to school means that more and more people want to push for better educational improvement on our side of the house. We think that then our side provides a critical, important impact of more attendance, meaning higher likelihood of quality change in the country's infrastructure. For example, improved quality of agriculture with more skilled individuals that happens on our side of the house. This is why I clash on whether either side improve the educational performance or student attendance on both sides. The first one proposition that provides is why individuals are not going to school now because they have external burden, but then they told us that, people have intrinsic motivation to attend school. Although this is a contradiction, we're going to take the best case scenario, which individuals actually don't go to school in a status quo because of external burdens. We think that the prerequisite for individuals to have intrinsic motivation to go to school and for the intrinsic motivation to go into action of going into school is parents knowing that there's an active benefit for students going to school at the moment, and second, that students have the ability to learn and intrinsic motivation to go to school. But second, they told us how government only helps schools at the start and that private companies have the incentive and investors to help afterwards. We think that this is not their own case because they're only able to hold company accountable at the start. This means that they're unable to be accountable for how the company operate in the future. This is very concerning because A, they're unable to access the way curriculum runs, as their second speaker told us is Western school, Western education, Western textbook, for example. This leads to potential problem of abuse or for potential implementation of ideology of things that students actually don't need to learn in developing countries. The second reason why it's problematic is that taking their best case, there's still higher tuition and less likelihood for average individuals to enter the education in the first place because there's no magnitude change when there's only a minimal amount of individuals who attend school as their second speaker concede to. The reason why the government is unable to provide, for example, tuition cuts as they try to shift their case to is that, as claimed, their first speaker said the government has limited funds, and this means that the government are unlikely going to give long-term tuition tax is happening under the House. The third point is that they must have, there's a very good system of good teacher opting into a revolving door and become a public school teacher of a good education. We think that, as Jim already told you, but also that the government cannot assert that Western education, like other private education, are actually better, because developing countries actually don't need a lot of, for example, novelists or a lot of historians. They need a lot of individuals who are very skilled and perhaps with equipped skill set for example, agriculture, for example, manufacturing. We think that those education that government can cater towards on our side of the house is very exclusive, because now government has the full control into the curriculum, into the individuals. They want the individuals. They want the okay.
Your analysis was that low turnout rate is the result of parents being too busy. If the tuition is the exact same, what is the incentive for parents to carry now under your side of the house?
We already told you the tuition is the same, but the subsidy is not the same. We tell you that we provide active tax code for individuals who go to school with, for example, 80% of attendance. This means that more individuals are likely to go to school. The reason why both sides are different is because on our side, we have more individuals already in the short run going to school. This is a prerequisite of long-term change, of educational quality change. The reason why proposition time don't work is because they concede that only some amount of individuals go to school. Those individuals who goes to school are already individuals who are rich on their side of the house. The reason why they don't incentivize majority of individuals go to school is because that those individuals will be seen as minority. Those individuals will be seen as individuals who are already successful, and they don't appeal to individuals who are currently poor and currently in, for example, the agriculture. This is why we think that on our side, we provide more magnitude change, because we have more individuals who are already in the educational system even before the change start. We think that these are the incentive for educational changes and quality changes on our side of the house, and that is how we're so proud to oppose.
Thank you, opposition for the fine speech. I'd like the next one will be opposition reply.
When people don't go to school, it doesn't matter how good your educational quality is. If people don't go to school, it means that crops simply cannot access any sort of impact that they try to claim, right? But firstly then, two questions I want to talk about under this reply speech. First, which side increases turnout rates? Prop from start tries to say that they acknowledge there are structural change, but they still try to hinge their main pull factor or incentive on the quality of education, right? We told you from first and second that this is a really faulty model, simply because that one, the public already has a bad perception of education. So even if the quality changed, they probably still wouldn't change that stigma that quickly, right? But secondly, then we tell you that the high fee and tuition cost of paying into these private schools is probably going to be the main deterrent from people actually considering going into these schools, right? But thirdly, then we tell you that the need of your family and of your own survival of putting food on the table is probably always going to outweigh the future potential gains that you might make from being from going into a good education, right? But what has Op told you then? We tell you that there are structural reasons why people cannot go into education right now, simply because that oftentimes they are needed in the family, or they have to go work, right? We solve this problem by simply covering up the opportunity cost that they lose from going to school, and we provide incentives for them to do so. For example, giving them some exemptions or giving them enough subsidies so that they were more incentivized to do so. Note that this is probably going to be the most effective model simply because that we are directly tackling the reason why people don't go to school in the first place. So I think we just simply win this clash and are more able to access change, which brings us to the second clash of this debate. Which side has a better educational quality? Prop tries to say that, these private industries have more connected and highly funded networks. This means that they're able to provide better quality of education. Two things as to why this is quite faulty. One, we think that they still haven't proven why the incentive given by the government would be enough for these private companies to use so much resources in this developing countries. But two, they still haven't. We think that insofar as the government under their side of the house cannot check whatever this private education institution is doing, these private education systems probably will want to cut costs and cut their quality of education. Right? Notice how Evan tries to counter this by saying that they're suddenly going to be pressured by the amount of parents who pay really high tuition fee for their students. We think that this is quite symmetrical on both sides because the people who are able to pay this high tuition fee are always going to be the elites, the rich parents, and it doesn't matter. It simply doesn't matter in this debate because they're still going to get good education under both sides of the house. What has Op told you? We tell you that when people go to school under our side of the house, they are more forced to learn, and because they know that there are risks, losing opportunity from earning a wage in work, right? But secondly, then we also tell you that parents would be more eager to ask, what exactly did they teach you at school? Simply because that their kids now are going to school instead of working, right? This means that there are better mechanisms for us to push for actual better quality of education in the long run. Notice how on the prop side, they try to talk about how there's going to be a revolving door effect of people going back into the industry, right? But we also tell you that these people are probably not going to be incentivized to stay in the country or work in the public education system when the pay is always going to be outweighed by the private educational institutions. Evan tried to sneak into this argument in his third speech by saying that they also allow domestic private industries to be part of their model, right? But we think that it's probably always going to be symmetric if they want to talk about it because these private industries are always going to be charged a higher tuition, hence being the equivalent of a private school. So I don't think there's much debate going around that. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank the opposition advisor for his speech. Close the debate entirely upon the government reply.
My speech in 3, 2, 1. Side Op is so obsessed with perfect equality that they don't explain what the implication of that equality truly is, but they also don't tell us why anything changes for these developing countries on their side. We know that the situation is bad, and we say that though no solution is perfect, but at least on our side, some people are able to get this benefit, and we've told you why increasingly more and more people will be able to get this benefit on our side. So first of all, why does their model not necessarily work? We've told you in Janet and Evan's speech that costs are simply too high to be able to subsidize every single person to be able to go to a school at an extremely affordable price. And also we say that it is still a bad system on their side. They don't tell us why the system changes for any sort of reason on their side. And because these systems are bad, they are even more likely to be overcapacitated by the amount of people that you're subsidizing and allowing to get into these schools, meaning that it's even more difficult for these schools to grow on their side. So now I'm going to move on to 3 important clashes in this round. First of all, on the accessibility of education that they focus the most on. We gave you reasons why the education is likely still going to be accessible on our side, because we told you that in part these companies will be willing to adapt to the local environments that you're in, because if your school is way too expensive, then no one is just going to go. So this means that they will adapt to best suit the environment that they're in. What this necessarily means is, for example, if they are in a community that is very, very poor, it means that necessarily there could be part-time school to make sure that people still go to school at an affordable price. Additionally, we say that Janet told you that even if it is the only the really richest people that are still going to schools at first, we say that that is still fine because because it means that at least a group of people now has an incentive to want to go to school because of the higher quality education that comes with the higher tuition, right? What this means is that educational elites are still going to are going to exist on our side, however, not on their side when they are all stuck in the same public schooling system. And Evan has told you that the benefit on our side is that we're able to have these people who are necessarily going to create the largest impact for the economy on our side, and we prevent brain drain from happening on our side. Additionally, we say that it's very unlikely for it to be as unequal as they say, because not all developing countries are extremely poor. We say that there are still like a large middle class that are able to afford like decent tuitions and things like that. What this means is that it won't be like every single person is not able to access this school. It's still like a substantial amount of the population is still able to go there. Secondly, on the quality of education, we have told you why why the governments on our side are able to learn from private institutions, and people who have learned in private institutions can be hired by the government to create a better public schooling system on our side in the long run. You can simply copy the way in which these private institutions have adapted to the specific context of your country, and that means that the creation of public schooling system on our side is going to be far better than on their side when you have to start from scratch and you have no blueprint for what a good system in your country necessarily is. Thirdly, onto the capacity of the government. We have told you that essentially for these countries, their main priority is the economy, and we say that there's a certain administrative capacity for governments overall, and because these are governments that are generally spread very thin because they have lots of problems to care about in a developing country. What this means is that on our side, we take this burden off, we allow the government to function more properly, we get a better system on our side in the long term. So proud to propose.
Alright, I thank the governor replying for that part speech, and remember, wonderful round. You can cross the floor, shake hands, and exit while I come to the birthday. I'll call you back when it's ready. Thank you.